Welcome to Mindtrip FM, your nightly historical haven. If our stories help you relax, fall asleep, or simply soothe your curious mind, please like, subscribe, or leave a comment telling us what kind of stories you'd like to hear. Now, let go of the day, close your eyes, and join us as we journey into a forgotten world. You would never imagine that in the dimly lit interrogation rooms of colonial outposts, there was a coffin waiting in the corner, not for burial, not for the dead, but for the living. In the early decades of colonial rule across parts of Asia and Africa, some officers relied on one of the most unnerving and psychologically crushing methods of extracting confessions ever documented. This was the coffin torture. It was not an official line in any legal manual. It was rarely recorded in court transcripts. Yet, in the whispered memories of those who survived, and in the dusty pages of hidden reports, this device appears again and again. Picture a crude wooden coffin, roughly human-sized, but with slight modifications. The inside was lined not with silk or cushioning, but with splintered planks. Some versions had nails driven inward, their points dulled, but still sharp enough to scrape skin with the slightest movement. The prisoner would be placed inside, the lid shut, and the air inside would become thick and stale within minutes. There was no light. There was almost no room to move. The moment the lid closed, a heavy silence fell, broken only by the prisoner's own heartbeat. Why did it work? The coffin did not crush bones. It did not require blood to terrify. Instead, it preyed on a far deeper fear, the fear of being buried alive. The loss of all sensory orientation, the claustrophobic panic that claws at the mind until it breaks. Colonial officers understood something that modern psychologists also know. The human brain reacts to confinement with increasing desperation. In complete darkness, time distorts. Minutes feel like hours. Breathing becomes labored, not because the air runs out quickly, but because the mind convinces the body it is suffocating. In the absence of movement, every sound becomes an echo of one's own pulse. The coffin became, in effect, a weapon that turned the prisoner's mind against itself. Survivors have described the initial moments as a rush of pounding in the ears, a frantic counting of breaths, and the desperate attempt to remember how long they had been inside. Very few could keep track. The heat would build. The muscles would cramp. If the officer allowed the prisoner to remain inside for hours, the body's discomfort would escalate into sheer mental agony. For the interrogators, this was the point. A prisoner, when released, would be confronted with a choice: speak and perhaps be spared a second visit to the coffin, or remain silent and face another session, possibly longer, possibly worse. Some colonial records describe the coffin being left outside under the burning sun. The wooden boards would heat up, turning the inside into an oven. In tropical climates, this could become lethal within hours. In colder regions, the coffin might be placed outdoors at night, leaving the prisoner shivering uncontrollably. Even more disturbing were reports of the coffin being partially buried in earth. This was not a full burial, but the sensation for the prisoner was almost indistinguishable. Dirt piled around the wooden shell muffled sound and trapped even more heat. Insects, drawn by the moisture and warmth, could crawl inside through cracks. The prisoner, unable to move, could do nothing to stop them. From the perspective of the colonial officer, it was efficient. No complex machinery, no expensive maintenance, just wood, nails, and the psychological weight of death itself. And unlike outright executions, it left no obvious corpses for families to mourn, no immediate scandal for administrators to address, yet the scars it left were deep. Survivors spoke of nightmares that lasted decades. Some could never sleep in enclosed rooms again. Others developed chronic breathing problems or heart conditions. The coffin torture became a ghost of the colonial era, rarely acknowledged, often denied, but lurking in the testimony of those who endured it. And like many tools of that time, it lived in the shadow between discipline and cruelty, where legality blurred and morality was set aside for control. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a former political prisoner in Southeast Asia during the late 19th century, whose testimony was quietly recorded by a missionary doctor. He described being arrested without formal charges and taken to a small wooden shed on the outskirts of the colonial garrison. Inside, the officers showed him the coffin. It was not new. The wood was darkened with age, stained in places by what looked like old sweat and something darker. The hinges creaked when they opened the lid, releasing a faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic. He was told, in calm and almost polite tones, that he could avoid the box if he provided the names of several suspected rebels. When he refused, the officers did not shout. They simply nodded to the guards. He was stripped to his underclothes and made to step into the coffin. The fit was so tight that his shoulders brushed the sides. His knees bent awkwardly, and when the lid came down, it pressed against his forehead. The air instantly felt heavy. Within minutes, the prisoner tried to keep his breathing steady, counting each inhale and exhale. But the darkness made him lose track. He felt his chest tightening, not from lack of oxygen, but from the crushing awareness that there was no escape. At some point, he heard scratching. A small creature, maybe a rat or a large insect, was moving in the narrow space near his feet. He could not move to push it away. After what he guessed was hours, the lid was opened. The sudden light burned his eyes, and the rush of cooler air almost made him dizzy. They asked again for the names. He refused again. This time they put him back inside, but tilted the coffin upright, so his body weight pressed painfully onto his legs. The wood cut into his skin. The hours dragged on. His mind began to fray. When they finally released him, days later, he had given up the names, not because he wanted to betray anyone, but because he could no longer bear the thought of returning to that wooden tomb. Such testimonies rarely made it into the official record. When confronted by inspectors or foreign journalists, colonial administrators described the coffin as a temporary holding device or a method of ensuring prisoner safety in transport. The reality was far more sinister. The coffin was never about safety. It was about control, submission, and the breaking of human will. Historians who have studied these cases point out that coffin torture was not unique to one empire. Variations of it appeared in different colonies under different flags. In some places, the coffin was replaced by a bamboo cage, narrow enough to force the body into a crouch. In others, it was an iron box, which could be heated over coals to increase the torment. The psychological effects were as devastating as the physical ones. Prisoners reported hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing flashes of light in total darkness, feeling the sensation of falling through space. Some emerged from the coffin unable to speak for hours. Others broke down in tears without knowing why. Modern trauma specialists would recognize these as signs of acute stress reaction. often the precursor to long-term post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the 1920s and 1930s, colonial officers interpreted them differently, as proof that the prisoner had been taught a lesson and would now be more cooperative. One officer's private diary, discovered decades later in a family archive, reveals a disturbingly casual attitude toward the practice. In one entry, he writes, "The box was effective again today. Subject talked after 2 sessions. No permanent damage that I could see. The men find it amusing to wager how long before they crack." This flippant tone hides the grim reality, the fact that human suffering had become a tool of entertainment as well as interrogation. But there were exceptions. A few officers refused to use the coffin, considering it dishonorable. In rare instances, they even reported its use to higher authorities, though these reports were often buried or dismissed. Colonial command structures valued results, and as long as the information flowed, few questions were asked about the methods. The coffin torture existed in this moral vacuum, protected by the layers of bureaucracy and the remoteness of the colonies themselves. In some cases, it was even adapted for public display, with coffins placed in town squares as a warning to locals. Passersby would hear muffled cries or see the faint trembling of the wooden lid, and the message was clear: defiance would not be tolerated. For those who endured it, survival was often not the end. It was the beginning of a lifelong struggle with fear. A former prisoner from North Africa described how, even decades later, he could not sit in a car with closed windows. He would break into a sweat in elevators. He slept with a lamp on and a window open, even in the coldest months. The coffin followed them home. It became a shadow in their daily lives, a constant reminder that safety was fragile, and that the human mind could be made to betray itself under the right kind of pressure. In some regions, the use of coffin torture took on a ceremonial aspect, blending punishment with public humiliation. The coffin would be placed in the middle of a marketplace, surrounded by soldiers, so that the entire community could witness the slow degradation of the prisoner. People would pass by, glancing nervously, some crossing themselves or muttering prayers, others turning away quickly to avoid meeting the prisoner's eyes. Children were sometimes deliberately brought to see it, as a warning from the colonial authorities. This is what happens to those who disobey. For many, that single image, the trembling wooden lid, the faint sound of labored breathing from within, stayed with them for life. There are photographs, rare and grainy, taken by foreign travelers in the early 20th century, showing these scenes. In one, a man's face can be seen through a narrow slit in the coffin lid, eyes wide, skin slick with sweat. A soldier stands beside him, smiling faintly, one hand resting casually on the box, as though it were a piece of luggage. These photographs were often confiscated, but a few survived, hidden in private collections or buried in archives until they were rediscovered decades later. What is most disturbing is how ordinary the setting appears. Stalls selling fruit and cloth stand just a few feet away. Life continues around the coffin, as if the man inside were invisible. This normalization of cruelty, the ability to treat extreme suffering as background noise, is perhaps the most haunting legacy of the practice. By the late 1940s, as decolonization movements gathered strength, stories of coffin torture began to emerge in political speeches and underground newspapers. Survivors stood before crowds and described what had been done to them. These testimonies were often met with gasps, but also with skepticism from those who could not imagine such deliberate cruelty. Colonial governments frequently denied the allegations, claiming that the stories were exaggerated or fabricated by rebels to provoke outrage. In official reports, the coffin was described as a protective holding measure used in rare and extreme circumstances. But the volume of consistent testimonies from multiple territories made these denials increasingly hollow. A turning point came during a high-profile trial in which several colonial officers were accused of war crimes. A coffin, seized from a storage shed, was brought into the courtroom. The judges examined it closely. The rough wood, the cramped dimensions, the faint but unmistakable smell that lingered in its planks. Survivors were asked to demonstrate how they had been forced inside. Some could not bring themselves to do it, breaking down in tears before they reached the lid. The public reaction was explosive. International newspapers printed sketches of the coffin, and human rights groups began demanding a ban on such methods. Slowly, the practice was abandoned, though not always out of compassion. In many cases, it was simply replaced by other, less visible forms of coercion. Yet the memory of the coffin remained. In villages and towns across former colonies, old people still speak of it in hushed tones. For them, it is not just a story from history, it is a lived terror, one that shaped the way communities viewed authority, resistance, and the value of human dignity. Psychologists studying generational trauma have found that the children and grandchildren of survivors often inherit certain fears. Some avoid tight spaces, others panic in crowded rooms, even without direct experience. The stories passed down in families carry enough emotional weight to alter behavior and perception. In this way, the coffin torture continues to cast its shadow long after the wood has rotted away. It is a reminder that cruelty does not end when the tools are discarded. It endures in the minds and memories of those who suffered, and in the quiet ways those memories shape the future. So, when we read about the brutal methods used to extract confessions in the colonial era, we are not simply learning about the past. We are confronting a pattern, the willingness of power to bend the human spirit until it breaks, and the chilling ease with which cruelty can be disguised as procedure. The coffin is no longer used in the open, but the mentality behind it, that fear is the fastest way to control, still exists in many corners of the world. It is up to us to recognize it, to speak against it, and to remember the voices that were nearly silenced within those narrow wooden walls.